Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and inspiring journeys of resilience, hope, and transformation. Today, we bring you a heart-wrenching yet uplifting story of Emily, a young mother who faced rejection and abandonment from her own family. Kicked out of her childhood home with her daughter Ava, Emily found herself at a crossroads. But through love, strength, and the support of those who truly cared, she embarked on a new path. Join us as we explore Emily's journey of self-discovery and the lessons learned along the way. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. The morning of my 20th birthday should have been filled with joy, laughter, and celebration. The scent of fresh flowers hung in the air, and the warmth of a spring day should have embraced me as I ventured into the world, excited for the year ahead. Instead, it began with the soft, urgent cries of my daughter, Ava. She was barely a year old, yet those cries were familiar, and they marked the start of a day I would never forget. I had been sleeping soundly, wrapped in the warmth of my blanket, when I felt a small hand tug at my arm. I blinked into the dim light of my room, groggily reaching for Ava, who was already wide awake and waiting for her milk. I scooped her into my arms, her soft body providing a warmth I couldn't explain. One that filled the emptiness I had often felt inside since I found out I was pregnant. Ava's baby smell, her velvety black hair, and her big brown eyes that were so much like her father's, kept me grounded through every storm in my life. As I stood there, holding her against my chest, I could feel my heart beating in time with hers. Ava's naive smile always soothed my anxieties. It was incredible how much love a single person could give, and in return, how much love they could receive, even in the most difficult moments. She was my reason for everything. She was why I was still standing, why I hadn't completely fallen apart. But as much as I loved Ava, there was a lingering pain that never quite went away. Her father, Jack, had disappeared the moment I told him I was pregnant. I still remembered that day clearly. I was sitting across from him at a small cafe, my hands trembling as I told him the news. His face had drained of color, and there was a long, uncomfortable silence before he muttered that he needed some time to think. That was the last time I ever saw him. He deleted his social media accounts, changed his phone number, and seemed to erase every trace of the life we had shared. At the time, I was 18, a high school senior on the cusp of entering university. I had dreams of becoming a writer, of studying literature and filling my life with books and stories. But once I learned I was pregnant, everything changed. The future I had envisioned for myself crumbled before me. My dreams were replaced with the reality of becoming a mother, alone. When I told my parents, their reactions were just as I expected. But somehow, they were even worse than I imagined. My mother's voice still rings in my ears. Shameful. You've stained the family name. Her words cut deep, and I could hear the anger in her tone, the disappointment that seemed to echo through every corner of our home. My father, too, was silent, but the deep sighs he let out told me everything I needed to know. I was no longer the daughter they had hoped for. They didn't understand. They couldn't, not in the way I needed them to. They were consumed by their own shame, embarrassed by the idea that I, their daughter, had made a mistake that could affect their reputation. The pressure of their expectations weighed on me daily. My mother, who was supposed to be a comforting presence, would scold me in soft, sharp tones while caring for Ava. If only you could have been more like Olivia, she would murmur, as if my younger sister had never made a mistake in her life. Olivia, perfect Olivia, the golden child, was always the one who could do no wrong. Olivia was 16 at the time, a cheerleader, an excellent student, and, of course, my parents' favorite. It was hard not to resent her sometimes, though I never let that show. She would look at me from time to time with a pitying gaze, her eyes a mixture of compassion and relief, as if to say, I'm different from you, and I'm glad for it. She never openly criticized me, but I could feel the judgment in the air, and that made it all the harder to bear. For the 2 years since Ava was born, I did my best to make ends meet. I enrolled in community college during the day, determined to give Ava a future better than my own, and worked at a local store at night, I spent sleepless nights studying, taking every opportunity to learn and earn a degree in childcare. It wasn't easy, but I made it work, driven by the love I had for my daughter. And when I came home late after my shifts, it was my mother who often took care of Ava, cradling her to sleep with a soft lullaby. Despite everything, my mother's love for her granddaughter was clear, though it always came with a hint of bitterness. "You know this is your fault, don't you?" she would mutter under her breath while changing Ava's diaper. "You were reckless." Her words never stung less, no matter how many times I heard them. But as hard as my mother tried to make me feel guilty, I couldn't let it break me. I couldn't allow myself to fall into that trap. I had a daughter to raise, and I refused to let anyone, especially my own family, make me feel unworthy of that love. The tension in our household had become unbearable. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope, trying to keep my head above water while my family's disapproval weighed heavily on my shoulders. Despite my best efforts, my mother's words continued to haunt me. "If only you could have been more like Olivia," she would repeat, as if those words could somehow make everything better. But they didn't. They just made me feel smaller, weaker. One morning, after I had finished feeding Ava, my mother called me downstairs. There was a note of urgency in her voice, something unfamiliar. My heart raced as I carried Ava down the stairs. The living room was silent, the usual hum of our family's activity replaced by an eerie stillness. My parents were seated across from each other, their expressions serious. On the coffee table in front of them lay a few pieces of paper. Documents that looked too official for comfort. "Sit down, Emily." My father's voice was unusually low, almost grim. I did as I was told, Ava in my lap, my heart pounding in my chest. What could this possibly be about? The air in the room was thick with tension. "Jane, we need to talk," my mother began, her hands shaking as she reached for the papers. My father's eyes never left me, his gaze colder than I had ever seen it. "It's about Olivia." At that moment, my heart skipped a beat. The words my mother spoke next hit me like a punch to the gut. "Olivia is pregnant," she said, her voice trembling. Time seemed to slow as her words sank in. I stared at her, barely able to comprehend what she was saying. "Olivia? My sweet, innocent sister? Pregnant?" I was still processing her words when my father cleared his throat and leaned forward. "The father is Chris. He's the son of the president of a well-known real estate company in the area. His family is wealthy." The name Chris meant nothing to me at first. But as my father continued, the reality of the situation hit me hard. Olivia's pregnancy was suddenly not just a family matter. It was a social event. The father wasn't just any boy, he was from a well-established, wealthy family. My parents were elated by the news, proud. Even, there was a sense of prestige attached to it. And that made it all the more painful to hear. I could feel a sharp pang in my chest. My mind raced back to when I was 18 and pregnant with Ava. I was terrified, alone, and utterly lost in the uncertainty of what my future would look like. But for Olivia, everything was different. She was the perfect daughter. The one who had everything going for her. She didn't have to face the shame and rejection I had endured. I tried to push the feelings of bitterness aside, but it was impossible not to feel the unfairness of it all. "Olivia's pregnancy is a blessing," my father said with a kind of finality in his voice. "Her child is a boy, and he'll continue the family line." I could feel the weight of their words suffocating me. They saw Olivia's pregnancy as an opportunity, a moment to secure the future of the family, to ensure that their name would carry on with a grandson. But what about Ava? What about me? I was a single mother, raising a daughter alone. To my parents, that was not just a disappointment, it was a disgrace. My mother's voice grew colder as she continued. "You and Ava will have to leave. This house is no longer a place for you." The world seemed to blur for a moment. The words didn't feel real. They couldn't be real. "Leave?" I whispered, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Yes," my father said, his voice firm and resolute. "Olivia and the baby will be living here now. Chris will join them. We've made our decision. You and Ava will have to go." I felt a wave of panic crash over me. But where will we go? I asked, my voice cracking. What am I supposed to do? My mother's gaze was cold. Unfeeling. I don't know. Figure it out. You're on your own now. Her words stung, and I could feel the pain swelling in my chest. The people I had always turned to for comfort, for support, were now turning their backs on me. There was no more compassion. No more understanding. To them, I was just a mistake. A single mother with a daughter who didn't fit their idealized version of the family. I looked down at Ava, who was resting in my arms, oblivious to the chaos unfolding around her. Her innocent eyes stared up at me, and I could see the trust in her gaze. How could I explain this to her? How could I tell my precious little girl that her own family had rejected her? That we were no longer welcome in the place we had called home? The weight of the decision pressed down on me, and for a moment, I felt as though I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to cry, to fight back, but I had no energy left. The fight had already been drained from me by years of disappointment, rejection, and unspoken judgment. All I had now was Ava, and I had to protect her. I had to keep her safe. Despite the crushing weight of the situation, I forced myself to stand. My voice was surprisingly calm as I turned to my parents and said, "Fine, we'll go." My father nodded, his expression unreadable, and my mother looked away, as if the decision had already been made and there was nothing more to say. That morning, I packed up the few things I could carry. My heart ached as I put Ava's clothes into a cardboard box. Knowing that this was the end of an era, my parents had made their choice, and now I had to make mine. As I carried our things out to the car, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, anger at the injustice of it all, sadness for the family I had lost, but relief that, for the first time, I didn't have to live under their watchful, critical eyes anymore. It was terrifying, of course, but there was also a sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in the shadow of my family's expectations. Ava clutched her stuffed bear as I buckled her into the car seat. I kissed her forehead gently, whispering words of comfort to her, though I knew she didn't understand the gravity of what had just happened. She smiled up at me, and for a brief moment, I felt the warmth of her innocence wash over me. But that warmth couldn't erase the pain I felt in my heart. My parents had turned their backs on us. They had chosen Olivia's pregnancy, a boy, over Ava and me. It was a hard pill to swallow. But I had no choice. I had to keep moving forward, for Ava. The car ride away from my childhood home felt like a surreal dream. The weight of everything that had just happened pressing heavily on my chest. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. But the only thing I could focus on was the fact that Ava, my precious daughter, was sitting quietly beside me, unaware of the gravity of the situation. Her small hand clutched her stuffed bear, her eyes wide as she peered out of the window, taking in the unfamiliar world around us. For her, this was just another adventure. For me, it was the beginning of an entirely new life, one I hadn't prepared for, but one I had no choice but to face head-on. We drove for what felt like hours until we finally arrived at my Aunt Jessica's house. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. My aunt had always been a beacon of kindness in my life. But even with her open arms, there was still a part of me that felt like a failure. How had I gone from being the proud daughter in my parents' home to being the one they had kicked out without a second thought? Aunt Jessica greeted us with a warmth that almost made me break down right there in her arms. She was the one person who had always believed in me, even when my own family didn't. I could see the understanding in her eyes as she gently took Ava from me and led us inside. "Don't worry, Emily," she said softly. "You're safe here now. You and Ava are going to be just fine." Her words, though comforting, only heightened the deep sense of loss I was feeling. How had I ended up here? How had my own parents chosen to abandon their daughter and granddaughter for the sake of a grandson they had yet to meet? The thought of their cold indifference made my chest ache. Inside Aunt Jessica's house, I was struck by how different it felt from my parents' home. The walls were warm, filled with pictures of family gatherings, birthday parties, and quiet moments of love. There was no tension here, no feeling of being unwanted. But even in this sanctuary, I couldn't shake the nagging voice in my head that kept telling me I wasn't enough, that I was somehow broken. That night, after Ava had gone to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Aunt Jessica, sharing everything that had happened. She listened quietly, her eyes filled with empathy as I poured out my heart. I had kept everything bottled up for so long that it all came rushing out in a flood of words. "They have no idea what they've done, Emily," Aunt Jessica said, her voice tight with anger. "To treat you and Ava like that, it's unforgivable." I nodded, wiping away the tears that had silently fallen. "I don't even know where to begin. I don't understand how they could do this to us. It's like we never mattered." "You matter," Aunt Jessica said firmly, her hand resting on mine. "You and Ava matter more than anything. And you have a family here who loves you. Never forget that." Her words, though comforting, didn't take away the hurt. But they did remind me that I wasn't completely alone. I had people who cared about me, people who would stand by me, no matter what. The next morning, as I sat at Aunt Jessica's kitchen table, sipping my coffee, I felt the weight of everything that had happened slowly start to lift. I wasn't in my parents' house anymore, and I wasn't living under their disapproving gaze. For the first time in a long time, I felt a small spark of hope. Later that afternoon, I posted about what had happened on social media. I had kept my feelings hidden for so long. But now, I needed to speak out. I needed the world to know the truth of what my family had done to us. I poured my heart into the post, sharing the pain of being kicked out, of being rejected by my own flesh and blood. What I didn't expect was the overwhelming response that followed. My phone buzzed constantly as thousands of people shared my post, sending messages of empathy and support. There were comments from other single mothers, from people who had experienced rejection and hardship, telling me they had gone through the same thing. The outpouring of kindness was overwhelming. "You did the right thing, Emily," one message read. "Your strength is inspiring." It was a small comfort, but it made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I had thought. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was my grandfather. His voice was unusually shaky as he asked if everything I had posted was true. I answered him honestly, and after a long silence, he said, "We'll be there tomorrow. Your grandmother and I will come to see you." When they arrived the next day, I could see the disappointment in their eyes as they looked at me. But there was no judgment, only deep sorrow. My grandfather took Ava in his arms, his eyes softening as he gazed at her. "I can't believe they did this to you," he said quietly. "You're not alone anymore, Emily. Your grandmother and I will make sure of that." It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a family that truly cared for me. A family that saw me for who I was, not just as a mistake or a disappointment. As the days passed, I began to realize that this new chapter of my life wasn't the end, it was a beginning. It would be hard, yes. There would be obstacles, but I was no longer living in the shadow of my parents' expectations. I was free to build a life for Ava and me. One where love, not reputation, would be the foundation, and in that, I found a quiet peace. As the months passed, life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Ava and I found comfort in our new home with Aunt Jessica. Her kindness never wavered, and though I still carried the scars of rejection from my parents, I started to heal. I found a job as a preschool teacher, and it was here, surrounded by the laughter of children, that I rediscovered a sense of purpose. Ava thrived in the daycare my aunt ran, her laughter ringing through the halls as she played with the other children. I no longer felt like a failure. With every passing day, I realized that true family isn't always about blood, it's about love, understanding, and support. My aunt had given me a home, a place where I was welcomed, and most importantly, where Ava and I were loved unconditionally. Although my relationship with my parents had become strained beyond repair, I found solace in the support of my grandparents and the online community who had reached out after my post. Their words of encouragement became a reminder that I wasn't alone. That the strength to rebuild my life came not from seeking approval from those who rejected us, but from within. When Ava is old enough, I'll tell her this story, not as a tale of pain and loss, but as a story of resilience, of finding one's worth despite the odds. I'll teach her that no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, your value isn't defined by others. You are irreplaceable. And as I sit here today, watching Ava play in the garden, I realize that what seemed like an ending was, in fact, just the beginning of something beautiful. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring life stories and journeys of resilience.